In October 2021, the Informer's political editor Anchor Singh became the target of a very negative social media campaign by Reason Party supporters after he showed that calls to suicide helplines were skyrocketing and that lockdowns had caused more harm than good. Now, it was a May 2020 coronial report that lockdown supporters used to support that there was no marked increase in deaths by suicide. But now, a recent report shows that there was a 9% increase from 2021 to 2022, correlating to Victoria's fifth and sixth lockdowns, with many young and older lives cut short because of it. Well, joining us again to discuss this is the Informer's political editor, Anchor Singh. Morning, Anchor.
Hi, Michael.
Now, the latest coronial report and the negative social media campaign run against you, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. It proves you right, and no one's happy about that, are we?
No, it's not always satisfying to be right, and certainly not on a solemn subject like this one. I would have rather been wrong, and I would have rather seen that there wasn't a market increase in deaths by suicide in that period. But unfortunately, the signs were all around us, and it seemed for a time that the society was divided into two very distinct camps, with one of those camps doing everything they could to close their eyes to what was happening all around us.
We've also seen, we've just had our school year start again here in Australia, and we've also seen exponential rise in school refusal, anxiety levels in children, behavioural issues in children that all flow again from the mental health aspects that were impacted by the lockdowns. Do you think you'll get an apology from any of these, I don't know, let's just call them rabid supporters?
I think we would be waiting a very long time if we expected any sort of apology, not just for those from those who supported those measures, but those who put them in place in the first instance. And, you mentioned something very important with regard to, children falling behind at school and children's mental health issues, behavioral issues to do with too much screen time and all of those things. And some of those developments that we're seeing now in a negative light had their beginnings again in those lockdown periods. It goes against all logic, but also the guidance from the World Health Organization at the time, that closure of schools in particular has to be only a very last measure. So the guidance from the World Health Organization at the time was schools in any sort of pandemic must be the last thing to be shut down and the first thing to be opened up. And that very basic principle was also not followed, certainly not in Victoria.
Do you think the government will ever be brave enough to actually have a retrospective inquiry or look at their response to this pandemic? Because now what many saw as foreseeable and what many of us thought was preventable by keeping schools open, giving children were some of the lowest risk cohort to succumbing to the severe impacts of COVID. Do you think this increases the need for an examination, for a retrospective look at our response?
In my view, it's the least any government could do, whether here in Australia or in any other country that implemented similar measures. But more important than that, I guess, would be the content of such an inquiry and how free and open it really would be. The sources of information it would use, the first-hand information that it would be allowed to gather, and also important would be who would be running it. Just to give you an example, New Zealand established such an inquiry not a long time ago, and they tasked to run it, to chair it. They tasked a an epidemiologist who was based in Melbourne and who was known to be a supporter of all of those measures. Which, when you think about it, effectively that person is going to be inquiring into the kinds of things that people like him and others who were also in support helped implement and helped disseminate information about, and certainly publicly supported. There's something wrong with that. So if you're, going to establish an inquiry like that, that pretty much already has a very obvious bias before it even begins, then there's not going to be much value in that.
Yeah, exactly. Now, a lot of people warned of this, and they were, declared and portrayed as catastrophists that were just negative, that were anti-lockdown, anti-vaxxers, all of these things. And again, this is one of those horrible occasions where no one wanted to be proved right. How do we get past that? And some of the vitriol that was directed at you was just it was emblematic of the whole period, where anyone who put their head above the parapet to express a genuine informed concern was attacked. And not only was that attack happening, but it seemed to be supported and encouraged by the government as a way of furthering their agenda.
There was a lot of instances of people behaving in ways that they thought in their minds would be the way they would be expected to behave by the people around them, or the people that they align themselves with, whether politically, socially, or at a friend's level. And so there was a lot of examples of where people may have felt, look, there's something wrong with this. It doesn't make sense. What's happening is illogical. And I've got my concerns and about it, but they were unwilling to say so for fear that they would be vilified, ostracized, and cast out by the people around them who had already formed some sort of a consensus on the way things were, and that was the right way, and anyone who dared to go against it. And we saw that again, that behavior by Reason Party supporters in that particular example. Interestingly enough, when that conversation was happening, I became the primary target of negative opinion directed my way by some of the most ardent supporters of the lockdowns and the measures, and also at the time there was a big debate around the proposed pandemic bill. It had only just been put forward. Those amendments that happened later to get rid of some of the more extreme elements of it hadn't yet happened, hadn't yet taken place. And these people who were supporting everything that the Victorian government was doing at the time with regard to those restrictions were also in full support of the pandemic bill in its first incarnation, which was also worrying, especially for a party that was set up to be a libertarian party, such as Reason Party, and to see how far that party drifted away from its origins and ended up supporting without questioning everything that the Victorian government was doing at the time, including all the authoritarian measures. It was just sad, but it also was a good example of how people at times like that can depart so far from their own principles just to fit in with the crowd, because that's where the crowd is and they want to be with them rather than standing alone for something that they personally believe in.
And now, rather than trying to assign blame or find fault hopefully we can move past that and with the benefit of hindsight go, it was wrong. We cannot allow it to happen again. But first of all, that first step surely needs admitting that it was wrong and there were consequences. Do you think we're any closer to accepting that there have been consequences, unintended? Some foresaw them, but those who put them in place, I'm sure if they were aware of them, wouldn't have done it. Do you think we're any closer to admitting to tying the two together, the increased suicide rate, the school refusals, the anxiety, the depth of stress in the community? Do you think we're any closer to accepting that it was an outcome of a poor decision?
At an official level, I don't believe we're there yet. I don't know how realistic it is in our political system and the way it operates to expect an official apology or reparations or some sort of an admittance of having done the wrong thing. That's such a rare thing in Australian politics anyway, even at the best of times. And when it concerns something like a three-year-old pandemic, now it's 3 years old, and all the things that have been done in the name of supposedly keeping people safe and protecting public health and things like that, and all the negative effects that have flowed out of the wrong decisions that were made in that process. The implications are big, and I think I think to expect that a government, any government, whether the previous federal government or this existing state government in Victoria, to accept responsibility for all of those things, I think it's not something that we're going to see in its entirety. There could be bits and pieces of revelations from time to time, and of course, if there were to be a truly free inquiry, they may end up having to accept, but not necessarily implement, because they don't have to, the findings of such an inquiry. So we could potentially see that. But what I am seeing around me, and I think you might be seeing similar things around you as well, at a personal level, a lot of people who did support those measures and who later either lived through some of the negative effects themselves or witnessed those negative effects around them and their friends, their family members, their community members. Some of those people are certainly beginning to say openly now, because the stigma that used to be attached to those views has certainly dissipated a bit in the meantime, over the time that's passed since the end of those horrible lockdowns. Mm-hmm. They are now beginning to say a little bit more openly that some of the things that they thought were right at the time actually were not, and that they may have supported those measures in error when looked at in hindsight. But that is something I'm seeing only on a personal level, not really at an official level, certainly not yet.
We could definitely go after the low-hanging fruit and walk them towards an outcome step by step. So we could surely say, well, how do you feel about the fact that when you entered a restaurant, you had to put your mask on, but once you sat down, you could take it off. But if you got up to go to the toilet, you had to put your mask on. We can agree. Not a lot of science in that. How do you feel about the closing of children's playgrounds as far as scientific mitigation of the pandemic? Surely we can admit that that was a wrong decision or a pointless decision. Surely we can then go on to say that, you know, what we know about the outcomes for young people and the poor outcomes for nursing homes means we could have redirected our resources towards protecting the vulnerable better and the less vulnerable less. Could we agree on that? And we could just go through. And so if it happens again, you know, not trying to assign blame and point fingers, but if it happens again, we're ready to go with an informed, you know, subjective, not objective, not subjective response. do you think we'll even get to that point, Anchor, where we can go, we cancelled sunsets. You could go for 1 hour outside, but you couldn't stop and sit down on that walk. We had police checking coffee cups to make sure people had their masks on. We had the Ring of Steel. We had there are so many ridiculous things. My industry, personal trainers, when they started to relax the settings, you could have 5 people training in a park, but if one of them was a personal trainer, it was illegal. We had Jim's mowing, where he couldn't have a self-employed man couldn't mow the lawn outside and have it paid by credit card, so no contact whatsoever. He wasn't allowed to work. Can we agree that that was pointless? We applied a blanket sledgehammer whole thing, everyone, rather than a nuanced, informed thing. Do you think we could accept that maybe that was wrong and we needed the government to do it? The ombudsman said the border closures were the worst decision she'd seen in her 7 years in the job. Rather than trying to facilitate a safe way to get people back, it was more about keeping people out. We saw people lose their homes, miss funerals, loved ones die on their own. Come on, we've got to have a proper look at this so that we can go, next time, let's get it right.
Yes, and even if we were to keep it very, very simple and just stick to the well-established pandemic plans that were already in place prior to the arrival of this pandemic, fine-tuned on the basis of the experience of previous pandemics that have happened, bird flu and so on. Even that would be a good start, because those pandemic plans that were on the shelf ready to be used prior to the arrival of COVID-19 did not involve any of those things. Certainly did not involve lockdowns, did not involve life as it goes on in the real world being stopped through blanket rules that were applied to the healthy and the unhealthy, as well as to those who were vulnerable, more vulnerable than others, and to those who had very little risk of hospitalization and death from COVID-19. That nuanced approach certainly was not implemented. And it only makes sense that in the future, whatever was done in this pandemic should really give way to the pandemic plans we had in place prior. And we must wipe the slate clean, go back to what we had beforehand, and forget about all the bad things that happened, and never consider putting measures like that in place ever again.
Yeah.
Because we have now seen with our own eyes what the negative impacts could be and have been.
Yeah. I can't recall who said it. It was a great philosopher said that the truth is like a lion, set it free and it will defend itself. And that went missing during this. If the truth was never set free, and we suffered as a result of it. So, Anchor, thanks so much for your time. Check out Anchor's writing on LinkedIn. It's some of the most insightful, informative writing. So if you're not already following, jump on it. I love reading it, and I'm a bit of a numbskull. So if I can get something out of it, I'm sure you will too. Thanks for your time, Anchor, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Michael.